Hey, how's it going? Ever since November 15th, 2001, a simple question has been posed, and that is, could humanity on its own today survive the flood? The consensus typically hovers around no, but no one in the videos that I've seen ever really seemed to take a good look at military weaponry and then compare it to the weaponry from the UNSC. And with Halo Infinite gaining more traction, it's kind of had me wondering lately, if the flood invaded today, what might actually happen? And since it's been 18 years, the Halo universe has expanded with more games, books, and other forms of media. All this further explained the lore and more specifically the weaponry of the UNSC. It's safe to say that we have a greater understanding today to both whether or not humanity could survive and how close our armament is to that of the UNSC. We're going to be looking at what the flood is exactly, a bit of geography, the weapons of Halo, and the real weapons carried by police, the military, and even civilians. Then we will compare those weapons to that of the UNSC, as I said, to gain a perspective of where we might stand in a fight against the flood. Should it check out? And I know it does because I did the looking and I wrote about 15 pages of notes doing this. Then I will probably totally make up a military situation and probably just make a military protocol wholesale to kind of depict or explain a situation where it's possible that humanity could survive a moderate flood outbreak. But first we need to know exactly what the flood is. The flood are commonly likened to zombies, but these nightmarish creatures would make The Walking Dead seem like a barbed wire, bedazzled baseball bat dodging vacation that you could probably guarantee you would prefer over encountering the flood in any capacity. The flood are a highly aggressive, ancient, parasitic infection that attack, infect, and then assume control of the host's central nervous system, while simultaneously mutating them to fulfill whatever role the flood might actually need them for. Whether it be turning them into combat forms or converted into infection carriers or just turned into biomass for later use, which is basically a pudding of human material or other animals that can then be molded together to make some sort of unholy, easy-bake creature that used to be human or pets or whatever they infect. But unlike your staggering zombie friends with the munchies, the flood have a protocol. From the point of an outbreak, their first hardwired action is to spread the infection as rapidly as possible to any and all infectable creatures. The goal is to accumulate as much biomass as possible, because then they will start to take that biomass and create spore mountains for one, but also a proto-gravemind, and as soon as the proto-gravemind assumes control, the flood are considerably more dangerous. Later, that proto-gravemind will turn into a full-size gravemind. The gravemind's important because the flood's known as a hive mind, which means that one central mind is in control of all the subordinates. The proto-gravemind thinks up strategic battle plans and implements them to further the infection and obtain enough biomass to form the full gravemind. And along the way, the flood will change tactics. No longer are the infectors or a bite or a scratch from a combat form a fast enough form of infection, and the flood will actually start to turn biomass into spore mountains, which will then turn the flood into an airborne infection, able to infect any animal with a central nervous system or a respiratory system. Beyond that, once they have enough biomass, they can actually start creating pure forms. These are those unholy human type pudding combat forms that I spoke of, but essentially it's just made from infected who were deemed useless in any other capacity. What makes the flood different from your standard zombies, aside from their ability to change infection tactics or have infection tactics at all, is that the Gravemind has an ability to exponentially acquire intelligence, and then because of the hive mind, it has the ability to disseminate that intelligence across the entirety of the flood. At the same time, it has the ability to gather intelligence from an infected individual that it may not even be face to face with. And what that means is that the Gravemind has the ability to acquire and store any useful bit of information. Combine that with the ability of the flood infection to mutate an infected person's body on demand, and you have maybe the most effective and dangerous zombie-like outbreak humanity could ever face. But now that we've basically summarized the flood, because we could really go into that for hours, they're basically a super zombie, okay? But now we really need to get into geography, because where the flood lands is actually really important. Equally important is the type of flood that make landfall, but geographically speaking, the flood landing somewhere densely populated like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Columbus, or any number of cities with a large dense population would prove to be nearly impossible to survive. The dense population, combined with the rapid speed of the flood infectors and the rapid infection to transformation to reanimation time of under 15 seconds, would make survival, as I said, nearly impossible if dramatic action wasn't almost instantly taken. And since this type of action is almost always an endgame, it's reasonable to assume that that step really wouldn't be considered or taken in time. But it isn't just the biggest cities that would prove to be tough to contain. Miami, Florida, Toledo, Ohio, and even Dayton, Ohio, with a little more than 140,000 residents as of 2017, would be a bad spot for the flood to encounter first. Now, the population of an area for the purposes of this type of mental exercise is actually a bit tough to nail down. If a city has 100,000 residents and the flood invade, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will infect all 100,000 people, or that everybody infected would be a suitable combat form when you consider the old, the young, and the disabled. Then you have to consider that the population of 100,000 includes everyone living within the boundaries of that city, which can include urban neighborhoods that generally surround the downtown area. That means that theoretically, if contained fairly quickly, a city of 100,000 might not infect 100,000, rather just those in an area impacted. But that doesn't even account for people who traveled there from afar, or people in the city to conduct business or visiting someone, but actually live themselves somewhere in the surrounding towns or cities. And this can change the current population actively in the city by several thousand. For that reason, we're not going to select a real city for this. Nailing down a realistic population proves to be really tough, especially since I couldn't find any solid travel data on local people visiting a city that they might live 10 or 20 miles from. Despite being an incredibly formidable form of zombie, the flood can be killed. The Halo universe uses several methods to terminate the flood. The Covenant and Forerunners, for the most part, use fire-based weapons, with the majority of the Covenant weaponry firing plasma, and the Forerunner Sentinels firing sustained beams of plasma. The Covenant does have a few outliers in their arsenal, such as the Brute Shot, and the Forerunners have the namesake of the game, the Halo Rangers basically kill everything in the universe that the flood could feed on, leaving them to starve to death for a few million years or however long it takes. See, none of that really matters to this exercise, because the idea is how could we survive, and in Halo, our faction, the UNSC, is where we need to look. Just like the Covenant and the Forerunners, the UNSC realized that the flood does have a considerable weakness against fire. And they do employ flamethrowers, and I'm going to put that to bed right now. The U.S. military voluntarily retired the flamethrower in 1979, citing it as an ineffective modern combat weapon. Incendiary weapons aside, the UNSC is still able to dispatch the flood with conventional weaponry by the means of severe lead poisoning. Then you have the fact that the flood can be terminated with any number of conventional explosives from a nearby rocket or grenade or even a tank shell. What this tells me is that our weaponry today might actually be suitable for combat against the flood, at least on the same level of the UNSC, with the notable exception of a few weapons like Spartans or Spartan lasers. So if the flood can basically be killed by any normal manner, but really has a weakness when it comes to fire, where do we stand? Well, the first responders would likely be police, and then you have civilians defending themselves. This could be with a variety of weapons for the latter and a select few for the former. But the most likely for a cop, and due to the popularity and high probability of being seen in the hands of civilians as they attempt to flee, I'm going to say more than likely the most popular weapon you're going to find out there would be the AR-15. An AR-15 looks like an M4 or an M16, and in most cases even fires the same ammo. The stark difference is that The M4 and M16 are assault rifles, where the AR-15 is merely a rifle. Sure, it looks similar, but that's about it. And the difference is that the M4 and the M16 are what are called select fire. And what that means is that aside from single shot, pull the trigger and one round's dispensed, pull the trigger, one round's dispensed, it also has another fire mode other than safe. The AR-15 doesn't, although some police departments do have ARs with full auto or select fire trigger groups. This is far more common for the police and kind of really difficult for the civilians. Yeah, they can get them, but it requires a lot of red tape to do legally. So we're gonna just assume that cops might have full auto, whereas civilians don't. And even then, cops, well, they generally, to my knowledge, don't like to fire them on full auto, save your ammo type of thing. Anyway, moving on. Alright, so what does all this mean? Well, in the world of Halo, the least powerful primary weapon I could find was the SMG firing a 5x23mm caseless round. It seems most comparable in ammunition and capacity to the real-world P90 and its 5.7x28mm round. However, the bullet weight and velocity for the Halo SMG is not something I could locate, but going off the P90's 5.7x28mm information to approximate that of the Halo SMG, we get a muzzle velocity for the P90 of 2,350 feet per second, or 715 meters a second. The round that is 31 grains max would impact its target at 394 foot-pounds of force, or 534 joules. This is important because this is the minimum primary weapon baseline that we'll use to compare to the real world, while mostly ignoring handguns due to the fact that most cops carry ARs, and a handgun would be highly ineffective due to the UNSC sidearm being a 50 cal and considerably larger and more powerful than most of the handguns used by the police or in public circulation. So when we compare the P90 to the AR-15, the AR actually ends up being the better option seemingly all around. Here's why. We'll say that our police officer was using surplus military ammunition given to the department or sold at a reduced cost, and had his AR loaded up with M855A1 ammunition, giving him a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, or 860 meters a second, with a heavier 62 grain round, delivering 1,393 foot-pounds of force, or 1,889 joules to the target with each and every round dispensed. And while there's probably hours of information out there about the ballistics of each, the point is that the P90 fires a round that is at least similar in size to that of the Halo SMG, and the AR-15 fires a heavier round that goes at a higher velocity and hits harder than that of the P90. Basically what that means is that our officer, or even fleeing civilian engaged in the flood combat forms with an AR-15, would have a weapon that is at least theoretically in the same ballpark as a Halo SMG, and more than likely even considerably superior, with the only exception is the AR has a standard magazine size of 30 rounds, falling short of the P90's 50 round magazine and the Halo SMG's 60 round magazine. However, AR-15s do have extended magazines that go all the way up to 100 round drums. So it's not like that's something that where the ground between the two weapons couldn't be made up. With the AR being the favorite patrol rifle of police and the most popular rifle sold in the US, it does mean that the flood outbreak could encounter some stiff resistance from weapons that have a greater range and theoretically are significantly more powerful than that of the Halo SMG. So if you weren't paying attention, the police and civilians have more than a few AR-15s, and we've determined that they are superior to that of the Halo SMG. What this means is that the primary rifle of the US military, the M4, falls in the same category, considering that it's basically the same weapon with the exception that it can fire in burst or full auto. And this is going to be important, so pay attention to that. So let's do a little bit to set the stage here before we go on with the weapons. And let's say that a piece of space junk from a far off planet or whatever, and kind of flew into our atmosphere and made impact with a mere 100 infector forms on board that survived the entry heat and impact and whatnot. Well, then of course they would exit the piece of space junk and head towards the nearest city, and we're going to say that this city contains between 50 and 100,000 people. And you don't need to be a genius to know that in the 21st century, word would spread pretty rapidly with video footage posted to the internet and then picked up and broadcast on the news. Leadership would probably throw away any rules about the military operating on U.S. soil and or potentially being used against citizens. And it's kind of reasonable to assume that the military would be mobilized fairly quickly, and you would probably begin to see troops arrive on scene within a couple hours as airborne soldiers would start to speckle the sky. Meanwhile, the heavy gear would probably be transported in by cargo planes, C-5s, C-17s, and then you have trains and trucks and even convoys. In the couple hours it would take for the airborne to arrive, we're going to say that the flood would be fairly busy combating civilians and police in the city, and nearby police around the city would probably be given orders not to enter, but rather go around and tell civilians to vacate their homes immediately, and that the Air Force could start to carpet the area. And that's kind of important for this entire exercise. And this is important for a few reasons, right? Because, number one, any civilians in the area, they're going to be potentially turned into more flood, but it gets a little bit, more nuanced, and I'll get to that in a second. The military is going to be looking to set up a quarantine around the city, and probably an exclusion zone or ring completely solid, like no holes and no gaps. And they're probably not going to be allowing anyone in or out. Maybe out if they realize that if they're walking and talking and they can stand there for more than like 15 seconds without turning into a flood, they're going to be fine. But then it's a question of whether or not they got spores on them. If it's turned to that point, it'd be a difficult thing for the military to handle, but more than likely no one in, no one out. And here's the problem with the exclusion zone. Cities tend to have a lot of homes that surround the city, and as well as that businesses. And they're gonna have to be destroyed because the flood cannot be given elevated areas to attack the soldiers or a means to approach with cover. This would best be done by the military releasing probably dozens of Moabs around the city to literally blast the residences and buildings between the exclusion zone and the city out of the way to give a clear field of fire. So that's why the civilians outside of the affected area would probably be warned to evacuate and to do so fairly quickly. So here it is, the moment where I attempt to go over a lot of current military hardware without taking a few hours to do so, and that means I'm going to be fairly topical. Splitting this up into infantry, portable weaponry, armor, and land warfare vehicles, and then air power, with the subsections of fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. So we've already covered that the AR-15 and of course the M4, that's a standard rifle for the U.S. Army and Marines, they're both theoretically superior in stopping power and certainly both have a far greater range than that of the Halo SMG. This means that every soldier or Marine with an M4 holding that solid wall of thousands of tons of armor and guns that is keeping everybody in or out of the city, they have a superior range and stopping power to a UNSC Marine that is equipped with an SMG. But this begs the question, what else does the military have for the infantry to carry? Well, let's cover the weapons that fire the same bullet as the M4 and AR-15. And those would be the M249 light machine gun, the M27 IAR, being used by the Marines to supplement the M249s, with the idea that the M27 would provide less sustained but more accurate suppressive fire. Along with that, you could find scoped variations of the AR platform, such as the MK12 SPR. The punchline is really the same though. The 5.56 by 45 millimeter round, whether fired from an M4, M27, SPR, or even sent downrange in a string by the belt-fed M249, ends up with the round still having more power and range than the P90 and by association the Halo SMG. And then next you have the 7.62 by 51 millimeter round. and it's actually going to be really important to this exercise. A large number of Halo weapons, including the Halo Assault Rifle, the Halo DMR, and that's not all. Despite being named a heavy machine gun, the AIE 486 is also a 7.62 weapon. You might recognize it more simply as the weapon you have mounted to the back of your hog. You know, the Gatling gun? Yeah, it's a 7.62. In reality, for the most part, the UNSC, even though being 500-ish years in the future, still use the vast majority of weapon, or at least rounds, that we have today. Alright, the 7.62, it's kind of been around since, at least in popular U.S. service, since Vietnam. It's widely used in the U.S. military. It's a sniper round for both bolt and semi-auto snipers. It's medium machine gun rounds found commonly through the M240. It's the round that's fired out of the M134 miniguns. It's fairly prolific, and it kind of is sort of good news for our survival that we still use the same round that they use in Halo. Now, while I didn't name off a whole lot of weapons, that pretty much covers the gun element. I mean, we're going to talk about a few more like heavy machine guns and stuff like that, but we're not going to be talking about shotguns. Because, well, yeah, you can find shotguns in the military. 12-gauge shotguns are kind of nowhere even close to the same ballpark as the shotgun in Halo, which is an 8-gauge Magnum. And even so, using a shotgun on the Flood would require you to let them in very close, and the whole point of this exclusion zone and setting up a field of fire by destroying everybody's homes is to give the military the ability to put the Flood down before they could even get close. So now we're going to be talking about hand grenades. And hand grenades, under the same principle as shotguns, they're going to be fairly useless. While sure, they can kill a couple densely packed Flood combat forms, as they do in Halo, the big issue becomes range. A hand grenade can only reach as far as it can be thrown, or it can only reach as far as it can go if its flight time exceeds that of the fuse. The most effective manner for soldiers and Marines to fire grenades on combat forms that would be charging the line would be 40mm grenades. These can be fired from underbarrel launchers like the M203 or the M320, or even a 6-barrel standalone revolver unit. It's kind of like a grenade revolver. It's pretty cool. These weapons have a range of about 400-ish yards, at least for the M203s. But then you have the Mark 19. The Mark 19 is basically a belt-fed grenade launcher machine gun. I mean, really, that's genius when you think about it. Someone says, I want a machine gun that shoots grenades. Say what you want, but we do come up with some ingenious weapons to mess up other people. Anyway, the Mark 19 doesn't fire the exact same grenade as the M203s. While they're both 40mm and they look a lot alike, they're not the same. And the Mark 19 is actually able to reach out and drop grenades about 1,500 meters from the point of firing. Trying to find my words. And last but not least, for the infantry forces, we have the big boys on the block, the weapons that can fire the 50 BMG, the round that around the world is kind of synonymous with power. And two weapons come to mind. The Browning M2 heavy machine gun, a gun that's been in service since World War II and is still going strong. It is a really big gun, but put a belt in that monster and it will literally blast anything your way into little itty bitty pieces. And then you have the precision dispersal of the same 50 caliber Freedom Seeds, slung down range by the Barrett M82 and M107 rifle series. Basically, the M82 and the M107 are the same rifle with a few changes, and the summary here is that they both fire the 50 cal, and they're both anti-material rifles with incredible stopping power. Now, it's worth saying that despite being 500 years in the future, the UNSC still uses the same basic bullet sizes, and the Halo sniper rifle fires a 14.5 by 114mm round, which dates back to World War II and was fired from the PTRS, and then later heavy machine guns. To that end, the 14.5 is a bigger and considerably more powerful bullet than the 50 BMG. So in the end, yeah, 50 cal is gonna, as a machine gun, it's gonna chop up the Flood but not to the same extent as an old ZPU, which is basically a couple of Halo sniper rifles on full auto. Finally, we can knock out the vehicles, which shouldn't be more than a couple of minutes long. Okay, here we go. Any Humvees that are still left around, along with HEMRAFs and the slew of vehicles along those lines, can all basically mount nearly any machine gun from the 7.62 M240 all the way up to the M2 and even the Mark 19. Light tanks basically come in two forms, and from an armament standpoint they're nearly identical. From a performance standpoint, not so much. The LAV can swim, but only in non-surf bodies of water, and the Bradley fighting vehicle cannot. They both have a 25mm Bushmaster M242 chain gun and a 7.62 M240 coax machine gun, which is basically the standard in tanks. The Bradley does have tow missiles, so there's that. And then you have the Striker, which is sort of the multi-tool armored vehicle, as the Army still can't seem to figure out what they want to do with them and exactly what they're good for. Some have remote 50 cals, and some have a 105mm cannon, and then there's a move to put a turret on them, which is this, the whole 25mm chain gun, making it the same as the others. So not a whole lot of variation there. Some have wheels, some have tracks, some can swim, some can't. Yeah, but that's about it. When it comes to heavy armor, there's really only one. The M1 Abrams family of main battle tanks. The M1A2 is commonly seen with the U.S. Army, and the M1A1 is still seen a lot with the U.S. Marines. Either way, basically, they're the same from an armament standpoint. The Abrams has a 120mm smoothbore main gun, a 7.62 M240 coax, and a 50 caliber M2 machine gun used by the tank commander. And then there's sometimes another M240 for the loader. The 120mm main gun fires a number of different ammo types, such as the M829 for tank killing, and with the new AMP round replacing a slew of current ammo types like heat and canister shells, there's a lot of promise for the lethality of the Abrams. And should these rounds actually live up to their hype, the Abrams would be able to engage the Flood with actually a fairly high degree of lethality. But again, that's assuming that this new round lives up to the hype. Now, hardcore Halo fans might debate this and might be thinking, well, my Scorpion's more powerful, and you'd be wrong. From an offensive standpoint, the Scorpion fires a heat round from a smaller 90mm gun, which is more in line with like the Tiger I from World War II, even though that was 88, it's close, at least in size, right? And Halo likes to throw in, oh, well, it's a high velocity, as if modern tanks don't have high velocity main guns. I mean, the Abrams slings the M829 downrange at an insane 3,500 miles per hour. So it's fairly safe to say that the Abrams is probably going to be superior. It's got the bigger gun, and you can say what you want about other aspects of life, but when it comes to tanks, size matters. And going off the Scorpion's effectiveness against the Flood with its smaller gun, we can reasonably assume that the Abrams would be more effective with a larger, more powerful gun and this promising new AMP round. Finally, we have artillery. Really fast, the types of artillery that really matter for this are the 155mm howitzer. It's either a standalone unit called the M777 or self-propelled, where it was slapped on a tank chassis and branded the M109 Paladin. Either way, they fire a variety of rounds that I'll probably touch on a little bit more later, but you can assume that, they have the basic ones like HE and whatnot. And then you have the MLRS and the HIMARS. Basically, they're the same thing. They're both rocket artillery. One of them looks a little bit more like a tank. The other one looks like a box truck. They both fire a few different types of rockets, with the most useful against the Flood probably going to be the cluster munition, which can carpet an entire area. And that's it. Land warfare is done. And now we have to talk about air power, which is fairly straightforward, despite the wide array of ordnance that can be deployed. But we're going to make it more simple. Helicopters really come in two forms. You have attack helicopters, which are the AH-64D Apache, which is becoming the AH-64E Guardian, and the AH-1Z Viper. The former is used by the Army and the latter by the Marines. The AH-64 is a bigger gun at 30mm to the Viper's 20mm. Aside from that, they both can carry Hellfire missiles and 70mm rockets. Either one is going to mess up someone's day. So and it's going to destroy the flood. They go boom, and the flood has a little bit of a weakness for things that go boom. Then you have transport helicopters. They come in smaller sizes like the UH-60 and the UH-1Y, and they're known as utility helicopters. The bigger sizes like the CH-47 Chinook and the CH-53 Super Stallion, which are larger and designed more for heavy lift type of operations, they're basically the same thing. They're just bigger, because it really makes no difference what type of helicopter they are. They're generally either armed with 50 caliber machine guns or M240s or M134 miniguns, both of which are 7.62 by 51 millimeter weapons. And then the UH-60 can carry rockets or missiles and alike, and has one other small secret which I'll mention in a few minutes. Finally, we have fixed-wing air support. Generally, this means fighter jets, and really simply put, they all can drop a vast array of guided and unguided ordnance ranging from small to very large. Fighters then generally have a 20mm cannon, and the A-10 has a 30mm cannon. Bombers are the same, with the exception that they can carry more ordnance and they lack the cannons. Finally, you have the AC-130s, which are fairly uncommon and come in a few variants, but have a 105mm cannon, a 40mm cannon, and a 25mm cannon on some variants. So, assuming that the origin city of the flood outbreak was not terribly large, both from a population and a geographic standpoint, so the military could completely seal it off, then in theory, we could be looking at 25 to 50,000 flood combat forms. And yes, that's a lot. But the military, by leveling the houses and having a clear field of fire around the entire city, would have set up the equivalent of a World War I no man's land, which is why the front almost never moved during that war. Troops couldn't advance without being completely exposed to incoming fire. The flood would encounter the same issue, while I'm not entirely sure leadership would send a probe into the city to attempt to help. If they did, it would prove to only increase the knowledge of the proto-grave mine, and allow it to impart any tactics learned, especially if they're like special operators, which would be a really big problem because they generally have knowledge of advanced combat tactics and weapon training. Anyway, it could impart that knowledge to the rest of its combat forms, increasing the fighting skill level of pretty much every one of the combat forms. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference unless they, are firing from range or they get close enough. Eventually, though, the flood would probe the military line or even launch a moderate assault. As you know, this assault would have to cross no man's land made by the Moabs. And if you recall, I said the UH-60 had another tool I would mention. Well, now's the time. The UH-60 can be outfitted with what is known as a volcano. A volcano is an aerial mine dispersal system able to disperse 960 landmines in 17 seconds, covering an area of around 1,150 meters by 125 meters. The system could also be deployed by truck if needed. It's not really important, but I guess still maybe useful. Anyway, aside from that, 155mm artillery batteries could start to open up on no man's land with Area Denial Artillery Munition System, or ADAMS for short, which is basically artillery-delivered anti-personnel mines. These types of preparations would mean that the flood would have no choice but to travel through an even more dangerous area than before. Now, when the flood does decide to send this probe or moderate attack, even if it were in the thousands, they would still have to cross maybe the most dangerous no man's land this world would ever see, with landmines, mortars, artillery, cluster munitions from MLRS units, and and traditional ordnance from fixed-wing aircraft, attack helicopters that fire scarily large bullets, Hellfire missiles, and 70mm rockets. And then you have an onslaught of similar scarily large rounds from light armored vehicles, the M1A1 and M1A2 Abrams taking out countless flood with a single shell from the 120mm main gun. And then you have the 50 cal that the tank commander could use. And if that's not enough, you then have an onslaught of grenades from grenadiers firing their underbarrel M203s or M320s. You have Mark 19 teams combined with rocket launchers that would be streaking into the flood, and a tidal wave of bullets from riflemen and automatic riflemen, and even machine gun teams manning the M240s and M2s that are not mounted to vehicles. And I almost forgot the possibility of snipers selectively engaging the flood. The point is with that much munitions and ordnance all landing or being focused on a single area, even if the flood attacked in all directions, it's just far too much ordnance, far too many bullets in one fairly small area, and it would not be easily defeated or powered through, not even for the flood. With that much weaponry, it's just unlikely that the flood could breach that type of military line without a large concentration of flood. And in most cases, the cities that contain enough people to make that large of a concentration of flood are too big to wall off with armor and guns. The flood would have little choice in this case but to fall back and plan. If they waited long enough, they could, in theory, win by default as they start turning biomass into spore mountains and making the flood virus airborne. However, from the cutscenes, it seems that the flood spores are rather large, and all things considered, even in the games, they look like a brownish fog, so they are fairly large. And they do seem to stay relatively close to the ground, which would make sense, as that would be where they would infect more animals. Something would have to be done about this, though, and there's really only 3 options. The military could go full tilt and release the big boys as they retreat. It would solve the problem, and would likely just totally destroy all the flood in any trace. I mean, spores, combat forms, all traces gone. The next option would be to continually strike the city with napalm day and night until it's certain that there's nothing left alive in the city. And the other way of achieving this would be kind of similar, but it would potentially have more efficiency, and that would be to round-the-clock artillery bombardment consisting of white phosphorus. This is actually an impressively scary munition. White phosphorus, or Willy P, is an incendiary weapon that has a unique trait that separates it from napalm. White phosphorus ignites from contact with the air, and even if it's extinguished with water, as soon as the white phosphorus is once again exposed to the air, it will reignite and will repeat until it's burned itself out. What that means is that you could have something on fire with white phosphorus, dunk it in water, and the fire will go out. But as soon as you lift it out of the water and the water runs off the phosphorus, it will start to smoke and reignite. It produces deep burns due to its ability to stick to skin. The other thing about white phosphorus is that it produces a thick white smoke that exposure too close to the source can result in death for humans. The smoke itself consists of phosphorus pentoxide, which is an anhydride, I hope I said that right, of phosphoric acid, which is sometimes used to sanitize dairies, food, and brewing facilities. Along with that, a little bit of info on phosphorus pentoxide itself is that it's a very powerful dehydration agent. It would be reasonable to assume that the smoke itself would be extremely toxic for the flood and their spores, especially the spores, when you consider that the smoke and its makeup of phosphorus pentoxide, and then its ability to cause severe burns to the eyes, skin, and mucous membranes. Along with that, it also will burn the respiratory tract. And then you have the whole dehydration effect and its endothermic reaction when making contact with water-containing substances like wood and or cotton. And then I wonder if the smoke itself wouldn't flow through the city, killing the spores in the air while the phosphorus burns everything else to the ground. And the idea is that the smoke from the phosphorus could get to places that the napalm couldn't get to, like a brick structure that may not burn. The smoke might be able to seep in through windows and stuff like that. Napalm will kill any spores that it burns, or any spores close enough to the fire that just the pure heat from that fire will kill it. And an entire city on fire would probably qualify as a fire big enough to do that, but if the spores are high enough in the air, it could be a problem that would best be remedied by the white phosphorus smoke. Ultimately, the first option would be the most certain, and honestly, anyone still alive in the city wouldn't stand a chance with any of the 3. The full tilt option would instantly do those people in, while the napalm would cook them alive along with the white phosphorus. And even the white phosphorus might even have smoke that's so thick that it would start to burn them from on the inside as well as any exposed skin. Truthfully, in such a situation, those people, they cannot be saved without giving the flood time to expand and wipe out humanity. And the first option would be the most certain to destroy the flood and the most humane, and that is truly a terribly horrific thought. In the end, the U.S. military, in the right flood invasion scenario, would more than likely come out victorious in a limited outbreak that was contained early on. But it would always come at great loss of civilian life, both from the flood and combating the flood. It would be a mess. The truth is, in many cases, without leadership going all the way, the flood would conquer our planet. Considering that the Forerunners needed to wipe out all life in the universe to stop the flood, and that might qualify the flood as the smartest, strongest, most resilient, and scariest zombie type ever thought up, but that wasn't the question. The question was, could we survive? And the answer is, yeah, more than likely in a small outbreak that the military could contain fairly quickly, and a willingness to go all the way if necessary, then yeah, there's a fair chance that humanity could survive. A large outbreak in a large city, it's unlikely, unless, of course, the authorization to go all the way was given almost immediately. Either way, it's going to be devastating for the population. But you know what? That's just my opinion. Let me know yours and discuss your ideas of surviving the flood and your ideas of what weapons or military tactics would best work and how you think you would survive this flood, because after doing a lot of research, I'm kind of interested in hearing other people's ideas. Anyway, let me know, and until next time, good night.